All right, everybody. Dennis Prager here, and the third hour every Tuesday is the Ultimate Issues Hour. I have various ways of explaining why it's so important, but I assume that by the very word ultimate, that sort of implies being the most important. Nevertheless, one of my favorite ways of explaining why it's so important is my map analogy. If you have a map that gives you every street and every lane and every drive and every highway, it's tremendously knowledgeable, but it's useless if you don't know where you want to go. So this hour is about where we want to go. This is the purpose of the map, not the map. The map is many of the other hours. This is what is happening on this lane and this highway and this drive and this avenue. But this hour is which avenue should you take so that you get to a good place. Ultimate Issues Hour, third hour every Tuesday. I'm Dennis Prager. I have a particularly wonderful guest today. I very rarely have guests on the Ultimate Issues Hour. I've interviewed God on a number of occasions. Moses has appeared, Jesus. Well, we've had, but very rarely. So it's a big deal when I have one, and he is a big deal. He's a professor of physics at the University of California at San Diego, and he is Professor Brian Keating. Professor Keating gives the latest Prager University course. And Professor, give me the name again.
It's What's a Bigger Leap of Faith, God or the Multiverse?
Yes. What is a big? Actually, it's the penultimate course. It was last week. What is a bigger leap of faith, God or the multiverse? Now, again, this is a physicist. You're a member of the American Physics Society. Explain to people what that means.
Yeah, the American Physical Society is a collection of what are deemed to be some of the more noted physicists in the country, and they only choose about half of 1% of the population of physicists each year to be members, and I was voted in 2016.
Okay, so one of the reasons I wanted you to tell everybody that is that you're a very highly regarded scientist. And I think it's important for this subject, obviously, and because you told me that some of the comments against you on the internet were, "Come on, why doesn't Prager you get a real physicist?" So he's one of the half of 1% of the physicists who are allowed to be in the American Physical Society, as well as a professor of physics. You know what happens a lot of times, Professor, you'll like this. Should I call you Brian or Professor?
Brian, please.
Yeah? You prefer that?
Just like my students do.
Is that true?
Yeah, some of them do. I get emails from them.
I want to talk to you about that if we have any time.
Sure.
All right. So it's a fascinating thing to observe the reactions of people. I get this a lot when I have a person of the left on my show or in a public debate. Then I will get a ton of mail. Come on, have a good leftist on.
Yeah.
And I don't know what constitutes a good leftist. I mean, I've tried to get the best. And so when they hear things that they differ with, they somehow challenge the credentials. But your credentials are really solid. By the way, he has a book out, which is fascinating. And we're going to get into that as well. It's called Losing the Nobel Prize, which is a great title.
Thank you.
Because you came close.
Yeah, I came close in more ways than one. I was actually part of an experiment that was heralded as being one of the most revolutionary discoveries in all of science by none other than your good friend Lawrence Krauss, noted militant atheist, self-proclaimed militant atheist at Arizona State University.
He was on the show.
Yeah,
yep.
He was, and he declared when we made our discovery that it was basically a shoo-in for the Nobel Prize, and it was one of the greatest discoveries to that date and in the future in all of human history. So we came very close to winning the Nobel Prize. Ultimately, as the title suggests, it's not a how-to guide on how to lose the Nobel Prize, but it's more a how-to guide on how to handle the adversity. You often talk about of very few people get into the promised land. Moses didn't get into the promised land, so you may not win an Emmy, you may not win an Oscar, you may not win a Nobel Prize, but it's okay. And how do you deal with that? And how do you handle adversity, especially when you strive for these really exalted things? In my field, the Nobel Prize is sine qua non, the most exceptional of all honors that you could win.
Right. So it's a human book as well as a science book and a detective book and everything else. So we're putting it up at DennisPrager.com, but it's called Losing the Nobel Prize, published by Norton, a very distinguished publisher. That, by the way, reminds me, I just want to tell my listeners, I love all the PragerU videos, and that's not a line, I do. But clearly some remain in my mind more etched than others. Yours is one of them, but what you raised reminds me of Tom Shalhoub. Everyone but one person has to deal with not winning the biggest prize. Yeah. Tom Shalhoub is a comedian. You know of him?
Yeah, I know the video you're talking about.
Oh, you do? Mm-hmm. Your kids should see that. I don't know if they're old enough, but as soon as they are, it'll help them a great deal. And I just want to repeat it, because tell me if this is exactly what you're referring to. Tom Shalhoub says that after a lot of his comedy gigs, people will come over and tell him how much they loved it and say something to the effect, well, so are you hoping to be the next Seinfeld? And he says, how many doctors are asked, are you hoping to be the next Jonas Salk?
Lawyers to be on the Supreme Court?
Yes, that's right. Every lawyer, yes, right, exactly. So, you're a really good lawyer. I assume you're aiming for the Supreme Court. Exactly right. And so... Is this analogous to what you went through?
Oh, absolutely. And to make matters worse, so we literally glimpsed, as I describe in the book, how we sought after the signal based on, in part, the lure of this gilded, which I call gilded graven image, which bears a picture of Alfred Nobel on it, because it is really... It has been elevated to the stature of religion among scientists, that it has all the trappings of a religion, and people are very reluctant to give up their religion. If anyone's ever had someone come to their door and ask them to change religions, usually they're pretty happy with it, and especially if you're an atheist. And so the religion of Nobelism, as I describe it, has all the trappings. It has holidays, it has feasts, it has fast days, it has saints, the laureates, it has sinners, the apostates like me, and then it has its.
How are you an apostate?
Well, I think the book is really written in a way that is meant to be a proposal for reforms, for 5 very concrete reforms that the Nobel Prize has to undertake. And if it doesn't, I think it will be, I don't want to say crucified, but we have this notion that these things last forever, and they don't. The Pulitzer Prize, as you probably know, used to be, actually, if you search Google, search words, I forget what you call it, but the tool that Google allows you to search the popularity of a word or phrase over time, the Pulitzer Prize was more distinguished for many years than the Nobel Prizes. In fact, the first couple of Nobel Prizes, the winners didn't even show up to get them. And nowadays it's 100 million, person affair, watched around the world. It's the foundation that awards is billions of dollars. But those things didn't stay. Just like the Pulitzer Prize no longer has the gilded sheen that it once did.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. All right. So that is in and of itself is fascinating, but it's the ultimate issues hour. So let's talk about this ultimate issue of who has taken the bigger leap of faith, those who believe in God or the multiverse. So can I summarize it and tell me if I've got it exactly right? Okay, I do this with authors a lot. The odds against life arising without a creator, without a designer, are so high as to enter the realm of impossible or border on the border of impossible. Isn't it, by the way, just curiosity, as a non-scientist, I'm curious, is there a level of improbability that scientists would say is essentially impossible?
Yes, and often they'll use that when I ask them, what do you ascribe the probability of God? because a genuine scientist will not say there is absolutely no God. And I don't believe that too many of them are actually strict atheists, although some are. So when I ask them, they'll say it's a functionally infinitesimal.
I see. And okay. And what is the likelihood of life arising on its own?
So I think in that case, you take a very big leap of faith, because you have to have a lot of different features and factors in the universe to inspire in just
okay. We'll be back in a moment with Professor Brian Keating, Professor of Physics. This is the Ultimate Issues Hour. All right, everybody. I just want to tell you something that we've partnered with. Ultimate Issues Hour's third hour every Tuesday. I don't often have a guest. I was kidding about Moses and Jesus. They have not appeared on the show. I know you didn't remember. It was before your time. Yeah. I'm not sure they would have come if they knew you were here. And that's not an insult. Yeah, but you got me Adam Carolla. All right, that's fair. That's fair, which is more accessible in the final analysis. Not very accessible, but more. Anyway, my guest today is Brian Keating, a professor of physics, and he's one of a tiny number of physicists in the United States in the American Physical Society. So he's a distinguished scientist. He has a great book out, Losing the Nobel Prize. And he did the Prager University course, which takes a greater leap of faith, the multiverse, or God. So I just wanted to get statistically, there is a point for scientists where it is so improbable as to become essentially impossible. Can I have the mic on for the professor? Mm-hmm. So tell me, what are the odds against... We'll get into multiverse in a moment. If this is the one universe, what are the odds against life having developed on its own?
So there's a famous equation in the study of what's called extraterrestrial intelligence. So this is the actual pursuit of measuring any signals that might come from another species of intelligent beings. Not necessarily, it won't be sensitive to bacterium on some, proto-Pluto located billions of light years away. But when they go through this calculation, it's called the Drake equation, they come up with numbers that range really wildly, from suggesting that life could be very common in the universe, technological life with radio stations and all sorts of things, to being almost zero and functionally equivalent to zero. So the life that we would really care about, I mean, it would be a revolution to discover the slime mold on some protoplanet, as I said. But the actual the odds of an existence of a technological life vary anywhere from extremely unlikely, so as to be essentially zero, to quite probable that in fact such life forms might be even discoverable by technology that we have on Earth.
So again, the odds are. Right now, what do you think? So, I mean,
a scientist will never quote a number without quoting their ignorance of that number. So when I have an ignorance of a measurement that I want to measure your height, you're 6'4" or so, but I always have to say you could be as high as 6'5", you could be as low as 6'3". You always have to give an estimate of your uncertainty, which you never hear from the scientists. You never hear that uncertainty. You just hear the odds are 0.00% against life, but there, the question is, what is the uncertainty, the ignorance, the unquantifiable unknowns about that number, and that can make the number extremely improbable. It could be as if I say you could be 2 feet tall or you could be 9 feet tall. Those uncertainties can vary by many, many times the size of the number itself. So the probability could be small, but as we've said and we say elsewhere, a small number times infinity makes this outcome inevitable in most scientists' minds.
Right. But we don't have infinity. That's where we're going to get to when we talk about a multiverse. Because putting again aside multiverse, folks, means that there are an infinite number of other universes, which is a fairly new idea, right?
Yeah.
But is the universe? Are there those who posit that our universe is infinite?
Yeah, so there are many that posit that it's infinite in space in a certain sense, and that we just cannot see given the time in which it was created. You could have an event that takes place where our Big Bang took place, started the universe expanding and growing, but that was growing inside a volume that we have no access to because the finite travel speed of light. So we're not able to see beyond what's called our horizon. Just like on Earth, there are things happening at the South Pole, and my telescopes are down there, but we can't see them with our eyes because there's a horizon that blocks us from seeing it. So it's possible that the universe could be infinite in spatial extent. It is also possible that the universe that we are now inhabiting is the remnants, the leftover shrapnel from a previous universe that collapsed on itself and somehow provided the fuel, the ingredients to make up every piece of matter that we have in this studio, in this city, in this world. And those both possibilities, infinite in time and infinite in space.
Right. So here I want to acknowledge my limitations. So tell me if my limitations are common but not universal or universal. I don't understand either possibility. I don't understand a universe that ends because my non-science brain immediately says, well, if something ends, what's after the end? Right?
Yeah.
The United States ends at the Canadian border. What is at the end of the border? Canada.
Right, but the Earth doesn't end. So there's many different ways mathematically of having what's called a compact thing, something that's compact like a baseball, that has no boundary, that you could keep going around the equator eternally and never come back to where you started perhaps, but there are other paths you could take that you never come back to where you started. So there are things that are compact and have infinite properties. Then there are things like an infinite rubber sheet. The infinite rubber sheet could also extend to infinity, but if if you were born on a certain day, and you can only see things back to when you got your first telescope, and it only allows you to see so far back in time along this rubber sheet, then you have a finite glimpse of what you can see amidst an infinite
space. Do you
space.
understand infinity?
Well, I think infinity, it's pretty big. When you get towards the top, it's very big.
Okay. Back to the odds against life and why they came up with the multiverse view. You can see his video at PragerU. You can read his book, Losing the Nobel Prize. He is a professor of physics at the University of California, San Diego, Brian Keating. Ultimate Issues Hour on the Dennis Prager Show, third hour every Tuesday. A distinguished scientist, a professor of physics at the University of California, San Diego, and a member of the American Physical Society, Brian Keating. And you will love his video for PragerU. What takes a greater leap of faith, God or the multiverse? So let's go to the multiverse issue. Tell me again if I have this right. I always try to bounce my understanding off my guest to see that I get it right. The odds against life are so, or to a certain extent, well, all right, let's just stick with life. The odds against life are so great within this universe that those who reject the idea of God, a designer, a creator, have posited the only other alternative, which is, well, yes, the odds against life in this one universe are very great, but not if there are an infinite number of universes, then of course we'll get life. Is that fair?
Yeah, of course. They don't really start this argument. These are physicists, cosmologists. We're not really experts on, biological evolution, et cetera.
So what is it if it's not with regard to life?
It's the laws of nature. So it's the laws of nature.
So it's even further back.
It's even more primordial.
Okay,
even more
good.
Exactly,
That's even better.
Right. So in a sense, the parameters. There's a wonderful book written by the Astronomer Royal of the United Kingdom, Martin Rees, who called his book just 6 numbers. And there's 6 numbers: the speed of light, the force between electromagnetic objects like protons and neutrons and electrons, and how they behave. And if you were to change the ratios of these different 6 constants, just these 6 constants, then not only would life not be possible, but perhaps our universe wouldn't even have existed long enough for us to be here. Certainly. So it's beyond life. It's even more fundamental.
So anything, the odds against anything are so great,
yes,
that the only possible explanation is that
it's anthropic, and they rail against the anthropic kind of explanations. And any other day, if you told a practicing physicist that the size of the hydrogen atom is determined by the anthropic principle, they would kick you out of kick me out of the American Physical Society. But on the other hand, if you say, well, the overall fine tuning of all the constants in our observable universe are so improbable that it is to suggest that we must be special in a certain sense. And this was a principle that was coined. Actually, the anthropic principle itself was coined.
Anthropic means human-centered.
Human-centered means that that without which these constants being the way they were, we wouldn't be here asking questions as to why they are the way that they are.
Right.
So this was actually proposed on Copernicus's birthday, 500th birthday, by some physicists who didn't understand why we were here. And the only way they could explain it is if they had what they called back then an ensemble of other universes, which other inhabitants could or could not inhabit. And it's kind of like, you're only who you are because you won the lucky ovary club, and you happen to be the egg that was selected. So there's a bunch of other eggs that didn't become Dennis Prager, but they're not here to wonder about how they came to be so fortunate as to be alive. And I think this comes down to a notion of probability. If something's highly improbable, the only way that we can know that the one event which we're certain existence, although some people say they're not sure we exist, and that's another debate. But if you do accept the fact that you and I do exist, then it's so improbable that with the fine tuning and the number of infinite knobs that could have been tuned differently for us to be here, that you really need this infinite possibility.
That you really need what?
You really need to have this infinite possibility.
Exactly. And that hence...
the multiverse.
Okay, right. So your thesis is, though, excuse me, while one acknowledges you can't prove God, let's be honest, we will never be able to prove the multiverse.
It sure doesn't seem likely that we will, because the multiverse, it's not enough to say, well, my theory is that the Earth rotates because it's on back of a turtle, at the South Pole, and then I can go down. I've been to the South Pole, so I can tell you there's no turtles down there, so you can falsify the hypothesis that a turtle is running the universe.
But you can never falsify other universes.
Because any consequence or combination of consequences is consistent with that. In another universe, I have the talk show and you're my guest.
Exactly. But that can never be falsified, you're saying.
You don't have access to other universes.
Right.
Some of them don't exist.
So how do they answer? That's such an obvious problem. How do they answer it?
I think a lot of them are intoxicated by the elegant mathematics behind it and the inextricable link between the multiverse and the so-called theory of inflation, which is what I explained in the PragerU course as this shaken can of soda, which is very difficult to say quickly. But the universe's origin spark that ignited the Big Bang is called inflation. And if inflation occurred, all the founding fathers and mothers of inflation claim that the multiverse is an inextricable concomitant phenomena that you cannot avoid.
All right, we shall return. Hi, everybody. Dennis Prager here. Third hour Tuesday is the Ultimate Issues Hour. Distinguished scientist, Professor Brian Keating, University of California, San Diego, Department of Physics. He's a professor and a member of the American Physical Society, which is a sort of a Hall of Fame of physicists. So he's been talking about the multiverse, the notion that our existence is so improbable that scientists now have argued, well, it's only improbable if we have one universe, but if we have an infinite number of universes, then obviously anything's possible. So is that logical? Is that something people would believe? I'm going to go to your calls in a moment. I just want to ask you about your fellow scientists. You said to me during a break just now that until recently, and the number you gave was 20 years, which is extremely recent, most scientists did believe in God. What happened?
Yeah, I think, back in the 50s and 60s, it was sort of the norm. And the scientists back then who did not like the Big Bang theory, they supported a theory called the steady state model. They basically said the reason that so many scientists were attracted to this nefarious Big Bang model is because so many of them were Christian and that they believed in the God of Genesis 1:1, which today sounds laughable even to me, who is a religiously observant person. But back then, in the 50s and 60s, I think there was a lot more believing scientists. Look, Galileo, Einstein, Newton's biggest accomplishment, he says, was his religious accomplishment. Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientists in history. So throughout history, people have had, scientists have had an ability to maintain the notion of the beauty of having two great mysteries to wrestle with. And I think that's what scientists love to do. We love to solve puzzles. If you want to see what a scientist is like, and there happens to be no nerd nearby, just look at a kid and playing with a new puzzle. When they solve a puzzle, they get a little taste of that thrill and that little endorphin rush. And they keep solving the puzzle even after they've done it. I see this with my 5 kids nowadays. And you look at how the little taste of it. Scientists love to solve puzzles. And my point, and this has been echoed by my fellow scientists who are religiously observant, Freeman Dyson, Martin Rees, and others, and they'll say things like, look, God is the ultimate mystery. Whether you believe in him or not, or whether you practice or not, the desire to wrestle with it and to find evidence, if you will, and I always say that science is kind of like God's vitamins. It kind of gives you strength to faith, because if you are faithful, then you should learn as much as you can about science, because it will give you an increased appreciation for it. And one of the things I don't like is when people explain everything and say, oh, God does this, God made that, God made the rainbow, God made the traffic on the 5 part for me. No, you should investigate things and understand what role is God essential for, if you want to believe in, and I'm not saying that people should not necessarily not confront beliefs of atheism, but on the other hand, I think agnosticism is actually the most reasonable, rational point. And I told somebody yesterday, my goal would be for 1% of scientists, of the 70% of scientists, to declare themselves atheists, that there is no God, to convert them to being agnostic. I think that would be a huge accomplishment.
So you think agnosticism is more rational than a creator?
I think it's it's more palatable to a scientist.
Palatable.
What is a science? I mean, the word science, and you've spoken about this before, the word science in Greek means knowledge. What does it not mean? It does not mean wisdom. So science and wisdom are totally unrelated things.
Right.
You get wisdom from a book like yours, or a book, your Bible commentary, but you get a wisdom from something, look, Stephen Hawking just passed away a month and a half ago. He wrote a book called The Brief History of Time. If I think even he would be upset if that book is a bestseller 100 years from now. I'm upset because it's in the same category as my book, but it is a bestseller. 100 years from now, if people are still reading it, it means that we haven't advanced scientifically at all in 100 years. Look at the Bible. The Bible has been a bestseller for 3,000 years, meaning it had to speak to people back then. It has to speak to people in the future many centuries from now, whether you believe it or not. And I think an agnostic person will say, well, let me look at the evidence and avail myself of evidence. And I think if you're a scientific person, that it surprises me when so many scientists believe in something that cannot even in principle be ruled out or falsified, like the multiverse.
All righty here. And let's see. Brandon in Tampa, Florida. Hi.
Well, thank you so much. And I've worked in science pretty much my whole professional career, but I'm actually a pastor part-time now. And the thing with the multiverse that's always befuddled me is how they get away. Basically, this is science fiction, right? It's basically Doctor Strange. They can't prove any of this, but they really avoid first cause. Like, why would we have multiverse? Where did it come from, and how is it maintained? Like, where are the rules of order that kind of keep it in place if it actually exists?
Okay. So, thank you, Brandon.
Thank you. So in that case, the most popular conception is that the universe created itself. And and they'll always make the simplistic art. Well, you believe God existed forever, but so in a sense, the universe can come from nothing, as a book was written by that title, and that essentially means that the universe is eternal. And, my point is that, well, if you believe in God, God could be eternal too. So the question I think you have to ask is not how can the laws of physics admit it. It is challenging to get such a scenario to play out. And there are more natural and beautiful and elegant theories in physics that can explain the Big Bang. But there's comparatively little attention paid to them because I think this multiverse has become so dominant in the marketplace of scientific ideas as to almost become a monopoly. I wouldn't say that no scientist, view the multiverse with skepticism, but most of them believe that in some version it's correct.
All right. Thank you. Staying in Florida, St. Petersburg. Steve, hi.
Hi there.
Hi.
Taking can of soda. Not so hard to say. My question is, I think we have, there's some crossed wires. There are two kinds of multiverses. And one is the one where there's an infinite number of possibilities of the physical constants. But the best concept of multiverse was proposed by Hugh Everett in 1955. And he was saying that in an attempt to take quantum mechanics from the Copenhagen interpretation and to a non-probabilistic location, he proposed a theory such that we have an infinite number of this universe.
Okay, hold on. You know what the caller's talking about? Great. Back in a moment.
Tell me a story that I can read.
Dennis Prager here. Time flies when you're having a good time, and I am with Brian Keating, professor of physics, University of California, San Diego, member of the American Physical Society, author of Losing the Nobel Prize, and has the PragerU video on the multiverse and God. So, did you want to have a quick answer for the last caller whose call most of us did not follow?
Yeah. So actually, the caller said, in addition to seriously shaken can of soda being easy, he also mentioned there's two levels of multiverse. He mentioned one called the many worlds hypothesis. There's actually 4 levels of the multiverse, according to some mathematical physicists, like Max Tegmark at MIT, who has a book about this subject, and I recommend it to the listener to get into.
Okay. Let me try to summarize a few things here. So Dave in Los Angeles says there are many things that occur where the odds are astronomical. You have a response to that?
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, the probability of any, of the events that led me into the studio today are, if you tried to ask what was the probability when I was born, you'd come up with 0. That's absolutely true. But you have to assign what's called a measure and sort of a standardization against which you can evaluate the odds of something occurring or not occurring. And for the multiverse, because you don't know the space of infinite possibilities, I couldn't be born on Pluto, but in the multiverse, there are possibilities that exist outside of computational ability because the number infinity is impossible for the human mind to grasp.
Okay, Robin Staten Island, New York says the multiverse idea is essentially science fiction.
So, that's a common complaint. I actually like science fiction a lot. I don't view that as a pejorative, but I will say, and that is a common criticism. But actually, it's based on extremely intricate, erudite mathematics and physics and observations that seem to be, at least not in violent disagreement with the fact that we do exist. And I think scientists should never give up the pursuit of the multiverse. I think it's healthy for science to have alternatives, but I disagree when scientists believe it with a religious, devout-like fervor that it is the truth, and I question why that is.
Right, and ultimately you think the odds are greater for a creator than a multiverse.
Yeah.
Okay, that's important because that's the bottom line here. Finally, I can't get to everybody. John in Brea, California, do you feel it's rational for Christians, or I assume other believers, to believe in both the multiverse and God?
Sure. I mean, that's like very, step 0 is that God could create the multiverse. I think that's well within God's powers of omnipotence.
Well, it's been a joy. Thank you for flying up.
Thank you, and not for not boycotting me. I was scared coming to university, being a conservative. I might get boycotted.
That's right. That's another subject I'd like to deal with you. We'll have you on that. Brian Keating is the professor. His PragerU video is up. And thank you, sir. Thank you all for listening.